time. Some of us seem to have too much of it, others can't seem to find enough time in the day. Time is a very important thing to keep track of. Can you think of a couple reasons why we need to keep track of time? Time measured. When starting to tell time, there are three important units that you need to keep in mind. The first unit that all time is built on is called the second. When learning to tell time, it is important to understand that seconds count in 60s, as in 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and so on. And it goes up from 1 to 60. When you have 60 seconds, that is going to equal 1 minute. This may be a little bit more common when counting and telling time. A minute is equal to 60 seconds. And it is also counted from 1 to 60, much like the second. Such as 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and so on. When you have 60 minutes, that is our biggest unit of time, called the hour. And it is equal to 60 minutes. Hours, however, work a little bit differently than seconds and minutes, and it is only from 1 to 12. And there are two different cycles, which you may know as AM or PM, which we'll discuss a little bit more on that. If you're a little bit more familiar with the units that time is measured by, let's take a look at what they look like on an analog clock. This is the most common type of clock that you will see in classrooms versus a digital clock. So when starting with the most basic unit of time, it is represented, each unit is represented by its own hand. The second hand will be a long, skinny hand that usually will be a different color than the other two, but it doesn't have to be. And some clocks won't have a second hand. This is important when learning to tell time, to remember that. The minute hand is going to be represented by its own hand as well. And this can usually be a long, sometimes fat hand that is about the same length as the second hand, pretty close, and that is important to tell the minutes. And lastly, the hour has its own hand as well. This is usually by a shorter, same color hand that is maybe a little bit fatter than the minute hand. And the position of each of these hands is going to be useful to tell you what time it is when being able to read a clock. Okay, now that we better understand which hand represents which unit of time, let's take a look and see how they all make sense. Like we said before, there's the basic unit of time, which is the second. And in 1 minute, there are 60 seconds. Each one of these notches is going to represent not only a second, but is also going to represent a minute, depending on which hand you are looking at. If you counted up each one of these notches, there would be 60 of them, meaning that there are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in 1 hour. And you also see the numbers 1 through 12, meaning that hours go from 1 to 12. So, in order to understand seconds and minutes, we're going to look at it just a little bit differently. Okay, what we're going to do is pretend that next to the 1, there's going to be a 5. Next to the 2, there will be a 10, and so on. This helps us keep track of which notch we are on, which lets us know how many minutes have gone by or how many seconds have gone by. So if we start right here, with this being 0, we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like you see written. It would go to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, much like you see written. So if we take a look at the second hand, we can see that it is pointing right to the 1, which we know is the 5th notch on the clock. So that would mean that 5 seconds have gone by. If we take a look at our minute hand, we see that that is sort of pointing right at the 6th notch, just 1 after the 5. So 5 plus 1 is 6. That would show us that 6 minutes have gone by. And it goes on the same way throughout every group of 5s on the clock. Now that we better understand how the seconds and minutes work, let's take a look at the hour hand, which works just a little bit differently than the minute and second hand. If we notice, I took off the second and the minute hand, and I have only left the hour hand on the clock here. And if we see where our hour hand is pointing, we see that it is between the 7 and the 8. This is going to mean that the hour is sometime between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock, meaning that if it was exactly right on the 7, it would be 7 o'clock, and if it was exactly right on the 8, it would be 8 o'clock. But since it is somewhere in between them, we would need the minute and the second hand to tell exactly what time it is. So I'll now draw those on, and we'll figure out what time it is. Okay, I've wrote in the minute hand and the second hand, so let's try to figure out what time it is. Okay, we talked earlier about where our hour hand is at, right here, and we see that it is sometime between 7 and 8 o'clock. So next we're going to move to the minute hand, and we see that it is at the 6, which, if we remember from looking at our other clock, is the 30th notch on the clock, which means that the minute hand is at 30 minutes. So if we go back to our hour hand, we see that it is between the 7 and the 8, but it hasn't quite reached the 8 yet. So we know that it must be 7:30, because it hasn't quite reached the 8 yet. If it had, that would mean that it would be 8 o'clock. But since we look at the minute hand, we see that it is 7:30. And if we look at the second hand, we see that it is right before the 5, which we remember was the 25th notch on our clock. So, and it is just 1 behind that, so 25 minus 1 is going to be 24. So we can say that it is 7:30 and 24 seconds. Okay, now that we have figured out that it is about 7:30, I'm going to show you how to write that in a different way. This way may be a little bit easier to read. This is the kind of way that you would see maybe on an alarm clock or maybe on a phone or something like that. And this way is known as digital. The clock that we see pictured right here is known as analog. So when writing the time, we can write it, since we know that the hour hand is right after the 7 and not quite at the 8, we will write a 7 right here. We will draw 2 little dots. This will help us tell the difference between the hours and our minutes. And if we remember looking back at our clock, we know that the minute hand is on the 6, which is also known as the 30th notch on the clock. And since it is right on the 30, we're going to write our minutes just like that. So, to the left of my hand is the hours, and to the right of my hand is the minutes. And we said that it was 7:30, so it will look just like that. Great job, guys. I hope you understood how to tell the difference between seconds, minutes, and hours. Tomorrow we're going to review that, and we're going to try to make sure that everyone understands how to tell time using both digital clocks and analog clocks. And we're going to have a little review and see if you guys remember how to tell time without using the little helper clock that we had drawn, and see if you can do that on your own. All right, so great job, and thank you very much, and good luck learning.